Hey guys, this is Bernard, kicking off what I am calling Sickle Cell Simplified, which is basically just a YouTube podcast, social media way of kind of spreading some awareness about sickle cell, giving some education on a pretty high level, so people can just kind of learn about sickle cell. I am a pharmacist and just going to talk through some of the different things we do to manage sickle cell, and yeah, just going to kind of dive into some of the background behind sickle cell. First, we'll start with something that's called pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is just a way to describe how and why a medical condition may occur. There's a few different things that come into play when we think about the pathophysiology of sickle cell. One of them being oxygenation, which is basically when the red blood cells are picking up oxygen from the lungs. Another thing is called deoxygenation, and this is when red blood cells are releasing oxygen out to the body's tissues. Another thing is called polymerization, and in sickle cell, this is when hemoglobin sticks together and form these long hemoglobin chains. There's also vaso-occlusion, which is the blockage of blood vessels by sickled red blood cells. And lastly is hemolytic anemia. This is where the body's red blood cells are being broken down faster than the body can replace them. I want to dive a little bit more into that first component of the pathophysiology of sickle cell. So let's talk a little bit more about oxygenation. Now, oxygenation is important because all the organs in the body need oxygen to make energy so that they can function and survive. The first step in getting that oxygen out to the tissues is we have to get it into the body. To do this, first we have to breathe in oxygen from the air. Then the oxygen travels to the lungs. In the lungs, oxygen attaches to red blood cells using a protein called hemoglobin. Again, that's just oxygenation, which is getting the red blood cells to pick up the oxygen in the lungs. Now, when we think about deoxygenation, this is when the red blood cells are releasing oxygen out to the tissues in the body. First, let's take a look at deoxygenation in a healthy red blood cell. What I've done here is I've depicted a healthy red blood cell in this bright red color, and then I also have healthy normal hemoglobin depicted in this bright blue color. Another name for healthy hemoglobin or normal hemoglobin is also known as hemoglobin A. So here we have our red blood cells picking up the oxygen from the lungs. Here we have those red blood cells giving off the oxygen to the different organs in the body. After releasing oxygen, the red blood cells return back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. Throughout the deoxygenation process in healthy red blood cells, the cell remains round, soft, and flexible during the entire process. And again, this is deoxygenation in a healthy red blood cell. This process is actually a little bit different in sickle cell red blood cells. So I've actually changed the color of the red blood cell from red to brown, and I've changed the hemoglobin color from blue to yellow to depict the hemoglobin S that we see in the sickle cell red blood cells. In the sickle cell red blood cells, the same process happens where the blood cells travel to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. The oxygen is then delivered out to the organs. Here's where we see the difference between the sickle cell red blood cells and healthy red blood cells. So when the oxygen is delivered out to the organs, the hemoglobin within the sickle cell red blood cells actually becomes stressed and cannot remain fully flexible like those normal red blood cells we saw earlier. This actually causes the red blood cell to become less flexible and more fragile, during this process. This sets the stage for something called polymerization, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. Again, that process of getting the oxygen out to the tissues in the body is called deoxygenation. The next process we're going to talk about is called polymerization. In sickle cell, polymerization is when hemoglobin sticks together after that oxygen is released out to the tissues, and the hemoglobin forms these long, stiff, rigid chains. For polymerization, we're going to be looking at a sickle cell red blood cell. So we have our brown red blood cell with the yellow hemoglobin S and then a green oxygen molecule. When an oxygen molecule is released from a sickle cell red blood cell, this sets the stage to start off polymerization. In polymerization, we have hemoglobin S forming what's called a polymer, where all the hemoglobin S molecules start to stick together. Now, polymerization forms these long, rigid chains that are inside the red blood cell, and this is actually what causes the red blood cell to form that sickled shape. Now, these red blood cells are going to be less flexible and more prone to block flow or break apart in the body. And again, in sickle cell, when the hemoglobin releases the oxygen and forms these long, rigid chains, that process is called polymerization. Next, we'll talk about vaso-occlusive crisis, and this is when the vessels get blocked by sickled red blood cells. Because of the long polymer that formed in the sickle cell red blood cell, it becomes sticky and they begin to clump together and stick to blood vessel walls. Here on the right hand side, I've depicted where they've started to clump together. As the vaso-occlusive crisis worsens, more and more sickled red blood cells begin to stick to each other and then stick to the blood vessel walls. And again, these blockages can happen to any area in the body. It can be the brain, it can be the bone, it can be in your eyes, it can be in the kidneys, it can be in the lungs, anywhere in the body. When these blockages are happening, it leads to pain and organ damage, which is also known as ischemia. Vaso-occlusion can occur in multiple ways. One of the ways is VOC, which is a painful crisis or a sudden severe organ damage, for example, something like stroke or acute chest syndrome. Vaso-occlusion can also occur gradually over time, where we see the slow, progressive damaging of the organs. Here's where we see something like sickle cell kidney disease or sickle cell eye disease. So that wraps up VOC or vaso-occlusive crisis, which is again that blockage of blood vessels by sickled red blood cells. Lastly, we're going to talk about what's called hemolytic anemia. This is a process where red blood cells are being broken down faster than the body can replace them. Eventually, old red blood cells must be broken down during this process. It's called hemolysis. Now, new red blood cells are actually made in the bone marrow during this process called erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis makes these new baby red blood cells that are called reticulocytes. Reticulocytes eventually will grow into these mature red blood cells that can carry that oxygen out to the tissues in the body. In sickle cell, there's an imbalance where old red blood cells are being broken down faster than new red blood cells can be made. This rapid hemolysis, or breakdown of the red blood cells, causes a special type of anemia called hemolytic anemia. In sickle cell, we actually see that the red blood cells don't last as long as normal red blood cells. Normal red blood cells will last about 120 days, whereas sickle cell red blood cells only last for about 10 to 20 days. So that basically wraps up everything for today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to check out this little podcast session, YouTube session. Just trying to kind of figure some things out. But yeah, definitely open to any feedback, questions, comments, concerns. Again, appreciate the time, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Thanks, and have a good one.